On June 29th, 2003, the police would get a call from a boy named Mark. Mark claimed that his best friend had just been stabbed and that they needed to get here fast. When the police arrived, this was a very weird scene. First of all, this was in a location in Altrincham in England, and stabbings just don't happen in this area. And so the police thought that was very, very odd. But the other thing that was odd was that they could not find this suspect. There was no person around that was there. I mean, this description of this guy was very vague. It was a young guy in his 20s wearing a hoodie, and that was it. Like, that's pretty much all he gave them. So like, that's very minimum. The police ended up going to one of the shops nearby. That's when they got a camera, and this camera pointed near the alleyway where this stabbing happened. They could not see any stabbings happening here, but what they did know is that no one was in this location around the time of this stabbing, meaning the only two people that were there was Mark and John. The police are already like, this is very suspicious, so they arrest Mark, or I guess they question Mark. That's when they ask him what happened, like what's going on. And Mark goes on to say, listen, I hear voices. But the police just really did not buy that, because Mark seemed really like stable-minded. They started to question him more on it, and eventually Mark confessed to stabbing his friend. The police needed to know why. Why would he just stab his friend? That's when the police found the most insane story ever, to the point that these two boys have had their identities concealed since then, that no one is allowed to know what these boys' names are. The police would go on to describe this case as like a soap opera. There's murder, there's kidnapping, there's betrayal, there's heartbreak, there's a love triangle, there's so much. This is the crazy story and case of Mark and John, and the crazy MSN story, because yes, MSN is a part of this as well, which really dates this episode. So let's dive in. Hi, welcome to the Decomposing Flower podcast. I'm your host, Jen. With me is Kira. In this podcast, we just talk about all sorts of things, whether it's true crime, mystery, or something that we just find very interesting. Today, we're going to be discussing a case that's called Mark and John. It's very vague. It's a very vague case. It was hard to find a lot of information on this case. It did happen in 2003 in the UK. And due to this case, a lot of information has been like concealed to the public. Not many people know about it, and it's overall very, very crazy. That's the best way I can describe it. A little disclaimer, I do want to say that I am not from the UK. So if I do say anything wrong, or I pronounce something wrong, or I just refer to the UK in the wrong way, please feel free to correct me. And again, if I say anything wrong in this episode about the case and you know more about it, feel free to let me know. So I just want to give a few trigger warnings just in case. We are going to be talking about murder, rape, child pornography, psychological abuse, abduction. So if any of that is just too much for you and you want to skip out, you can watch another one of our episodes or do whatever you feel like you need to do. And we'll see you in another episode. How I want this episode to go is I'm gonna just sit here and tell you the story, and then at the very end of this episode, I actually want to have a little bit of a conversation surrounding this case, because I think there's a lot of things we can kind of talk about. I know typically when we do these episodes, we kind of just tell the case and then we just end it, but I kind of wanted to have a little bit of a conversation. So for most of us, we have spent our entire lives on the internet. Unless you're like a little bit older and you maybe didn't have social media the way I did, I grew up with social media. I'm 28 and MSN was a big part of my childhood. If you are American, MSN is basically AOL. I think MSN is like the European and the Canadian version of AOL. I don't know if they're like exactly the same thing, but they're essentially the same idea. If you're very young and you're listening to this and you don't know what that is, think of it like Discord, just very dated. Obviously, it's not the same kind of way Discord is. Discord is a lot more, I don't know, better? Is that the right word to say for it? MSN is just very iconic. A lot of people, including myself, we have always used social media, especially if you feel very alone. Like most people, Mark was like any other 16-year-old boy. He was going to school. He came from a working class family in Manchester, and he seemed to have a lot going for him. He was planning on going to business college. He spent a lot of his time what most teen boys do. I'm sure he played video games. Again, there's not a whole lot of information on the people in this case because it's been pretty concealed. He had good grades, he was playing soccer, and one thing he really, really wanted was he wanted a girlfriend. Of course, that led him into MSN. Now, I don't know if he went on to MSN to find a girlfriend or if he just went on MSN to chat with people who I don't really know. Mark joins this kind of like this chat room in MSN, and that's where he meets this really cool girl named Rachel West. Rachel was kind of this like mysterious and this fun girl, right? She and Mark would just talk for hours. She was the same age as Mark, and they just had a lot of fun together. And one of the things about her was she promised Mark she would send a picture to him. And again, this is a time era where you didn't typically just show people what you looked like. You know, this was the time era where people were very much like, you need to be very careful who you talk to, but also a lot of our parents at that time just didn't really know much about the internet. And so a lot of us were just on the internet, raw dogging it, doing whatever, right? So yeah, people didn't really just send off their picture. Also, I don't even remember if in MSN if you could send pictures. Obviously, you could talk on the webcam, but it was kind of common for people to not, you know, just send off pictures. Maybe. Also, if you're listening to this and you were like maybe a teenager in 2003, let me know. Like, tell me. So, anyways, so there's like this allure of this girl, right? Because he doesn't even know what she looks like. And like most people, if you're talking to someone, even if you're listening to my voice, you might think that I sound very attractive, and then you see a picture of me and you're like, oh my god. Or vice versa, you might think my voice sounds hideous. I don't know. But there's that thing where you hear someone's voice or you're just texting them and you kind of envision this like attractive person. And I think for Mark, he kind of envisioned this super hot girl because, I mean, she was so cool and mysterious and she really wanted him. So, not long after, though, he met Rachel. Rachel would have her younger brother, John, create an account and he would join the chat room. And so now he had another friend. And so this was kind of like a win-win for Mark because not only did he have this like really cool girl that he was flirting with, having fun, chatting with her, he then also had a friend. And that was just like really cool. And they all lived in the same area. Mark fell for Rachel really, really hard. I mean, he's 16 years old. He even would go on to tell John about it, and, you know, John probably was like, ew, like, that's my sister, like, okay. John and Mark also got along really, really well. They liked the same things, and I just think overall it was like a win-win situation for all of them. But one evening, another person would join this chat room, and this was like, I think this was an adult man. His name was Kevin, and he would go on to describe himself as a self-proclaimed gay man, which I think is kind of funny as a way to describe himself. Self-proclaimed. Interesting. The thing about Kevin, though, is he would begin to harass Mark and John, and he eventually started to harass and threaten Mark by using Rachel. Kevin would say to Mark that he was going to rape and kidnap Rachel. He had a proposition for him. He said, listen, I won't do that as long as you can get on camera with me and you can perform a few sexual acts for me. Mark was willing to do this for Rachel because he didn't want her to be raped or murdered or anything. Of course he's going to do this. At first, Rachel would say to him through an MSN chat log saying, you don't have to do anything for me. And Mark would reply, I do, Rach, I love you. And she would say, I love you too. And so Mark started a webcam call with Kevin, and he did just that. So because of this, Kevin kind of left them alone, and this kind of built up the bond between Rachel and Mark because he was willing to do something so, you know, uncomfortable and messed up for her, and she felt like, oh my god, you really do care for me. They decided, you know, we should really take our relationship to the next level. We need to meet up. And I don't really know how long they'd been talking at this point. I think it was a couple months. It might have just been a month. I'm not too sure. They were like, let's meet up and let's hang out. So Mark, he takes like a 40-minute train to some location that he was going to meet her in, some shop. She never shows up. And see, this is the time era again where you didn't just have people's cell phone numbers. You didn't just give people a cell phone number. You didn't even, some people didn't even have phones at the time. Like a lot of times it was just like, no, you just had like a landline. If someone wasn't online, they just weren't online and you would have to wait for them to come back online. I think Mark was kind of waiting a bit because, maybe she's a little bit late. But after a while, Rachel's just not there. And so Mark's kind of like, that's like really weird. I need to go figure out what's going on with her. And he's like hurt, probably confused. He doesn't know where she is. Did she just ghost him? Did she just lie to him? He thinks no. There's no way she did that. Possibly maybe she got caught up. See, this happened all the time, right? You would say to someone, I'm going to meet up with you, and then they wouldn't be there and they'd be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I had to go do something. Whether it was a lie or someone was just like too scared to meet up with you. Regardless, a lot of times you would have to wait and then they'd be like, oh my God, I'm sorry, my mom wouldn't let me leave. So when Mark gets home, that's when he goes on his computer. He's like, I'm sure she's going to send me a message, but she never did. But what he did receive a message from was Kevin. And that's when Kevin went into great detail about how he had kidnapped Rachel and how he had her gang raped and he murdered her. And he went into detail about how she cried for Mark and how she bled all over his sheets. And I think he was even taunting him like, she cried for you. And Mark was like, well, how the hell was I supposed to know where she is when no one told me? Like, I think Kevin was trying to taunt Mark, saying like, you were supposed to be there and you weren't. Look how bad you are. Mark was just devastated when he heard this. He was just like, I mean, who wouldn't be? Your girlfriend is murdered. Even if you'd never met someone, you'd be devastated. This just shattered Mark. His grades dropped. The one girl that because he really, really liked her. And maybe he did love her, or he thought he did, but she was gone and he didn't know what to do. He became very depressed. He also became very angry and he started to act out, obviously, through his grief. He never told the police or his parents, and I'm not too sure as to why. I don't know if he thought maybe John had already, like his family had already contacted the police. And I don't know if he was afraid to go to the police because of Kevin, because maybe Kevin was going to come after him next. His parents, I don't know if it was because he wasn't that close. Again, this is a time era where like you didn't just tell your parents things because it was a little awkward, right? Like if you told your parents, I'm talking to someone online, most times your parents would be like, no, the hell you're not. Like that's probably some crazy person. Like you just didn't do that. But I don't really know his reasonings as to why he didn't tell anyone. Obviously, he began to confide in John, because John was the only one that he had been talking to about Rachel, because Rachel was John's sister. And of course, John was devastated. His sister just died. They kind of get closer through their grief, which is very typical. Most people do this a lot. But by April 2003, so I think this was like a couple weeks later or a monthish later, someone else had actually entered this chat room, and it was this person by the name of Lindsay East. Mark was really struggling mentally, and I don't know if he started to talk to Lindsay as a way to kind of cope and deal with what he had been going through, but he fell for her as well. I don't know if this guy just like falls in love with any girl that he talks to, but as they got close, they began to kind of tell each other's secrets. And that's when Lindsay would actually open up to Mark, and she actually said she was a British Secret Service agent, a part of the MI6. Mark was kind of already like, that's kind of like suspicious, like what's going on? But then Lindsay would go on to tell Mark that the reason she was in this chat room was to watch John, because Rachel was already murdered and now John was under government protection, and that since Kevin had killed Rachel, he was going to be next, and Lindsay was here to protect John. She also told Mark that he was a really good friend and that he needed to keep John safe. And I think that kind of made Mark feel a little bit special. He was kind of like, maybe this is a reason to exist. Maybe take back what Kevin did. He did whatever he could to help protect John. It wasn't too long until Lindsay disappeared, and then Mark would receive an email saying she was actually taken out by the British Secret Service and that now he needed to protect John. But then it gets really, really weird because Rachel, for some reason, returns back from the dead, claiming that she was in a coma for the past month and that she was pregnant with Mark's baby, the baby that they never met. So I don't know if she like programmed her ovaries into his computer. I'm not too sure how she got pregnant, but she gave birth to his baby and then she just disappeared. I think Mark might have thought that this was either a troll. This might have just been someone who found out about what happened and was like messing with him. Or if he thought maybe Rachel has gone mad? I'm not too sure. But then again, she just vanishes and she never comes back. But it wasn't that long until another person would enter. And there was like multiple people that would come in and out of this chat room, and it was pretty common for people to join in. But it was another person that comes in, and it's this woman named Janet Dobinson. She was 44 years old, so quite a bit older. Also, I think Lindsay and Mark also were chatting, and she was an adult. And like, they weren't just like chatting, like they were like, he was choking his chicken in front of her on the webcam. So it was very like, ooh. So now he's talking to a 44-year-old woman who's like this real estate agent, and she's just like kind of selling homes, but her marriage sucks. Her husband is terrible. He doesn't love her. She's touch starved. She's a mom. Even though she's 44, she still goes on to describe herself as being very, very sexy. I think that's very, very funny that she needed to reassure him, don't worry, I'm still pretty sexy. I'm still pretty hot. As they would begin to talk, they would kind of do, like he would also get on camera, and I don't know if he would get on camera and touch himself or if he was sending pictures or what, but they were doing the same thing. But as they got closer, that's when Janet kind of spilled the beans, and she was like, well, actually, I'm not really an estate agent. I'm actually a Secret Service agent. That's a cover-up. And she would go on to say that she actually worked with Lindsay, but she's a higher up rank than Lindsay. She's like one of the top 3 most important people. She's so important. She works so close to the crown and even the queen. She starts to really flirt a lot with Mark. And again, they're doing a lot of sexual things. But because of him doing this, she says, you're so obedient, and we could really use you. We could really use you in the British Secret Service. She would go on to tell Mark that if he just completed a few tasks, he would go on to meet the Prime Minister, he'd meet the Queen, he would meet the Defense Secretary, head of the British Secret Service, and he himself would be initiated into the British Secret Service, and he would make a lot of money. You might think, well, of course, like, why would he believe this? But she had proof. She had straight up proof that she was part of this. She would go on to tell Mark how she knew everything about him, and she would list it off. And when Mark was kind of like, how do you know all these things? She would say that there was a bunch of spies in his city. That these spies were postmen, that they were the ice cream man, that they were bus drivers and teachers, and anyone walking by was a potential spy, and they were telling her information about Mark. This kind of just made it more believable, because she was like, I saw you wearing that like blue shirt today. Trust me, like, I have spies and they'll tell me if you don't do it, and you're doing everything you're supposed to. So Mark was like, she's obviously right. That's when Janet kind of gives him this little task. She says to Mark that he needs to be John's bodyguard. Because again, John, he needs to be protected. And she tells Mark that if he protects John, he will get 300,000 euros and he'll become very successful. So she would say, what I need you to do is go to the school and take out John from school, lie that he has to go to the dentist. Don't tell John, because John can't know about this, because if he knows, it won't be good. Like, he needs to not know. He needs to think that you just want to spend time with him. Janet goes on to tell Mark, in order for him to be a true initiative, to be truly a patriotic person and for the Queen, and to become an agent, that he needed to be around John. He had to pretend John was gay. She told Mark that he needed to be very intimate with him. Mark felt like he needed to do this. He felt like he had no choice. He needed to do it for the crown. He was a true patriot. He needed to protect the Queen, and he needed to also protect John. Janet also promised him 300,000 euros and also sex from her. And so, of course, he's like, okay, I guess I'll suck a dick. I'll get money, and I'll also get sex from this hot woman who I've never seen before. Totally will do it. I really would like to know how that went down, because John and Mark were hanging out and they had a sleepover and they apparently played video games and then they watched porn, and then Mark had given John oral sex. And I would really like to know how that conversation went down. I'm a little confused about that. I want to know, like, the conversation was like Mark just like, I'm doing this for the Queen. Like, very interesting, very weird. But after Mark does this, he thinks, okay, now I'm going to be going to London. He's like prepared to go to London by that weekend. And he's like, I'm going to London. He's like, what will I tell my mom? And Janet's like, don't worry, you'll be able to go there and we'll tell your mom everything. Your mom will know everything. You get to talk to her. Don't worry. But she's like, you have one more mission. And Mark's like, oh, I thought that was all I had to do. She's like, well, no, you have to do one more thing. And this would make you millions. And you would also be one of the top 3 like Janet. But you needed to prove yourself. And that's when she would go to ask him a question. And that question was, could he kill someone? So Mark, of course, is probably thinking, well, maybe she's asking me if I could kill someone in the future for the queen. And I mean, of course he can. He'll do that. I mean, he was a patriot before, he'll do it now. So she goes on to ask him this. And this is like directly from their MSN chat logs. Could you kill someone close to you? You might be tested on that later on. I don't know. I probably would, but I want to know why. I haven't really thought about it. Janet, well, think please. And then Mark goes on to say, yeah, I could. There's my answer. But this wasn't a hypothetical question. This wasn't just like a, maybe in the future you're going to have to kill someone. She said that Mark needed to kill someone close to him, and that would be John. She went on to say that she had been on a very close watch with John. And a few things about John. Apparently, John had a code in his head, and that there was this like treasure at the bottom of the ocean, and they needed to get it because it was like a big amount of money and like a diamond. But she also said that she went into John's emails, and that's when she found that John had received an email from his doctor claiming that he had a brain tumor. And she also found out that this brain tumor was inoperable, that he was going to die within like the next few weeks or the next few months. Because of this, John was actually preparing to shoot up the school because of this brain tumor, and also because John was like severely bullied, very, very bad. She kind of justifies it to Mark. She's like, listen, you're not technically killing him because he's gonna die anyways. You're just doing it quicker. You're doing it for the queen. You gotta be a patriot. Don't you want to be a true agent? Like, this is what agents have to do. They have to do a lot of hard stuff. And she's like justifying it to him. And Mark's kind of like, you know what? I think you're right. Technically I'm not killing some random guy. He's also going to die pretty quickly. It's not like it's really gonna change a whole lot. And so he's like, okay. And so that's when on June 28th, 2003, Mark would talk to Janet about this mission, and he would say to her the famous lines, "You want me to kill him?" And Janet would respond with, "Yes." And Mark's kind of confused. He's like, and just leave him to die? What do I say to him? Stand there while I stab you? He's kind of like, how do I do this? Like, how do I kill him? Like, what? And Janet's like, no, you need to tell him that you love him. And Mark goes on to say, I love him, but this has to be done. Mark's clearly confused, but he's kind of like, okay, like this woman knows she's probably killed a few people in her time. But that's when Janet would give Mark all these details. She told him where to go, what to use, and how to use it. She gave him a whole lot of details. She told him that he needed to go hang out with John, and that they needed to go somewhere quiet where there wouldn't be anyone, and he needed to go get a knife that was sharp enough to make John bleed to death. And she also said, you need to make sure you wear gloves so that no one sees your fingerprints. She even told Mark, go to this drugstore called Boots. Get this kind of knife. Get this perfect knife. It couldn't just be like a kitchen knife, right? And she says to Mark that, you can take John with you, but you cannot let him know why you're getting this knife. She says, pretend it's for your mom. And then she says to Mark that he couldn't call the ambulance after he stabs John. That when you stab John, you need to wait for him to kind of like not die, but be very close to death. Then call the police, claim that someone stabbed him, and then when the ambulance arrive, he most likely will die on his way to the hospital. And then she says, and I'll be at the police station waiting for you, and then once you're there, I'll take you to London, and then you'll become an agent. But she also gives him one important thing. She says, there will be an abort code, and if you hear this code anywhere through some sound system, if someone walks by and says these words, if you hear it all, you need to stop. And that abort code was 6969. And so she says, if you hear that, stop. But from there, that's what you need to do tomorrow, and I'll see you tomorrow. So the next day on June 29th, 2003, Mark and John are hanging out. They're having some fun, shopping in Altrincham. They would go to the drugstore Boots and they would pick out this knife. I think John actually picked out the knife with Mark. Like, he was like, this is a cool knife. Like, maybe you should do this one. As they were hanging out, they kind of were waiting a bit because I think Mark was waiting to hear the abort code. I think he thought that this was like a test, like to see how far he would do it. But he didn't hear this code. So they go walking in this like dark alley where there's no one, and that's when Mark kind of grabs John by the shoulder and he kind of turns him, and he has the knife and he stabs John in the chest and in the stomach while saying, "I love you, bro." John starts immediately screaming like, "Dude, call the ambulance. I'm dying. You stabbed me. You've killed me." And Mark is like, "Don't say anything." He's shushing him. He's like, "People will hear. Be quiet," which is like, yeah, that's kind of the point why he's screaming. And John goes, "You've killed me." Mark goes, "Don't let that be the last thing you say to me. Don't let that be the last thing you're saying." I think Mark was pretty, traumatized from this. I don't think he really wanted to do this, but it had to be done for the queen. So after 20 minutes, he pulls the knife out of John and then he calls an ambulance. And that's when he tells this ambulance, "My friend has just been stabbed by this crazy guy in his early 20s. He's wearing a hoodie. I don't know where he went, but my friend is dying. Can you please get here?" And he's like freaking out. The police get there. They're already like, this is so crazy. They rush John to the hospital, but luckily John actually survives. He had 2 surgeries. I believe he had his gallbladder removed. He wasn't supposed to live. They said it was like very crazy, but I think he almost died while on the table. But for now, they just want to hear Mark's side of the story. And that's where Mark says that there was this guy. And so they're like, okay, we're gonna go looking for it. But as the police start to go looking for the suspect, they can't find anyone. They're like, this is really weird. There's no one here. Again, this is not a place where anyone gets stabbed. And so the police are already like, this is kind of suspicious. They did not know who they were really looking for because Mark gave such a very vague description. And so they went to some of the shops nearby and they found a closed circuit camera. It was kind of at the base of the alley and it could see where Mark and John were, but it couldn't see the stabbing. So they didn't have direct proof of who stabbed John. But obviously they could tell that no one was in this area between the time of the stabbing. There was no one who went there before, during, and then it was just Mark leaving, obviously, when John's going to the hospital. So they're like, okay, the only person who could have clearly stabbed him was Mark. So they go to arrest him for attempted murder. And that's where they show Mark the footage and they're like, dude, come on. So that's where Mark goes on to say, "I hear voices. The voices told me to do it." But they didn't buy it for a few things. Number one, Mark was really, really traumatized. And typically when people have a psychotic break where they hear voices and maybe a voice or hallucination or even a delusion is telling them that they need to kill someone, they kind of have a vibe about them where you can tell that they're detached from reality. They might not even have that ability to understand what they truly have done. Usually these types of people are just like, yeah, I killed them. And obviously a lot of people try and play this card, right? I hear voices, but it really is really hard to actually play the insanity card because it's not the way people depict it so wrong all the time. But with Mark, it was more so that he was really bothered by it. It wasn't even Mark was bothered that he got caught. It was more so he was bothered by the entire situation. He was pretty traumatized from stabbing John. And the other thing about Mark was he wasn't a boy that got in trouble with the police. So the police are like, you need to tell us what happened. We know it's not the voices. We know there was no madman. You need to tell us what happened. The thing about Mark was he was still waiting to hear from Janet, but he didn't hear from Janet. Janet wasn't there to take him to London. I think Mark was waiting a little bit to see maybe she was maybe she got caught up. Maybe she got caught up selling some houses, or maybe the queen needed her, but he didn't hear from her. So that's when he tells the police, okay, listen. So I was on MSN and there was this woman named Janet Dobinson, and she actually works for the MI6 or the British Secret Service, and she was initiating me and she told me that I needed to kill John because John has a code in his head and he's also going to shoot up the school, and that's why. And so the police are already right, they believe his story, what he said, but they're they know it's not the British Secret Service. I mean, the British Secret Service does not recruit you through MSN and being 16 and also getting on the camera and getting a little bit freaky. They don't do that. Could you imagine if you found out that any Secret Service agent was recruited through Discord? That would be so crazy. So the police are okay, we need to figure out what actually happened. I think Mark would go on to say that John and him had been talking to these people that claimed this, and he was protecting John. And so the police needed to go look out for this because they're maybe John's in danger. Maybe there's a group of people that were trying to kill John, because that could have easily been it. But the police did not know what they were looking for. So they end up taking both of John and Mark's laptops, and they had to go through all of the chat logs and find everything they could. And they found so much shit. It was like mountains of chats. They found over 58,000 lines of text in total. They found 138 gigabytes of data in both of these computers. They basically said if they were to print this out, it would have been equivalent to 46,000 feet high of like paper, which is so insane. And so when the police like are looking through this, they don't know what they're looking for. They don't know if they're looking for school bullies. Are they looking for a ring of pedophiles? Because that would make the most amount of sense. The fact that Mark was going and doing all of these sexual acts and doing this, like maybe there was a group of pedophiles that were recording him and filming him and, you know, wanting to sell CP and wanting to do all that. And, you know, the fact that he also performed oral sex on John. And I don't know if he filmed it or if it was through MSN as well. Like if he had to put it on for Janet for proof or if he just had to do it. I don't really know. But the police are like, this sounds like a pedophile. I mean, of course it sounds like a pedophile. Who would do that? Like they're thinking, we don't really know who's doing this, but they're like, we need to see if this is like a ring of pedophiles. They kind of went down to narrow this list down to be about a couple people, and one of them was obviously Janet. There was Rachel, Kevin, and then Lindsay. And one thing that they kind of noticed about all these people is that they all had different personalities. They were very intricate. They were very unique. But they would all spell the word maybe the same way. They would spell it as my by, which was a very interesting way of spelling it. And they kind of came up to this conclusion. They're like, you know what? Maybe, just maybe, it's not multiple people. It's one pedophile that's running this entire thing and is just trying to groom Mark. But then that's when they noticed that someone else spelled maybe like that. John spelled maybe the exact same way. And so they're like, that's interesting. So then the police start to realize that all the data and all these accounts were logged on John's laptop. So the police are starting to wonder, you know, maybe it's John's family. Like maybe there's a family member that's a creep and they've been logging in, pretending to talk to Mark, pretending to be John. And they needed to kind of find out who was this last person logged in. And that's when they find that the last person that was logged in was Janet. And so they're like, okay, we need to kind of figure out who was at home the last time because then we'll be able to tell. So they find out Janet's the last person logged in, and then they find out that no one else was home except for John. So the police are like, we need to go to the hospital. We need to go question John and ask him. And that's when John tells them everything. He spills. He's like, yeah, there's no Rachel. There's no Janet. There's no Kevin. There's no Lindsay. It was all John. In fact, there was a shit ton of more people. There was over 193 accounts and emails created, and they were all John. So this entire time, Mark had been chatting with John. In this article that I was reading, they described it so perfectly. They would describe it as the world Mark knew was written, directed, and produced by John. So this entire time, Mark had been chatting with John, but Mark did not know. Mark was none the wiser. He did not know. He thought these were all different people. The detectives described John's laptop as an internet soap opera, moving from one scene to another, from each character's storyline more fantastic than the last. Some plots were taken from film and in life, filled with treachery, villainy, betrayal. They were empty of hope. And that was one of the very interesting things too, is because Mark and John really like this movie called Catch Me If You Can. I've never seen the movie, but the movie is with Leonardo DiCaprio, and it's about this guy who has a bunch of multiple identities. And so he kind of was like taking a lot of these things from movies and stuff. And see, Mark did not actually know any of this. And it wasn't actually until the trial when they were presented all this information, Mark was like, oh. And Mark would be quoted saying, I've been such a fool. But the police had a question. Why would John do this? You know, as much as like faking a relationship, pretending to be Rachel, why would he go as far as to plot his own murder? And the same fact is, he had an abort code, which, by the way, can we just go back to the abort code being 6969? I just think that's kind of funny. They were like, why would John do this? Why would John lie to Mark for so long, his friend? And why would he want to get himself murdered? And with this abort code, why didn't he use it? Was it that it was too late? Did he just want to fuck with Mark? Why did he create this entire world? So there's a lot of discourse on this and a lot of different information and stuff. A lot of people believe John created this kind of realm as a way because he was so lonely. But as he got more into it, he kind of felt trapped and stuck and he couldn't get out of it. Now, there's a lot of things to say about this. I know for a lot of people, sometimes when you're on your computer and you're just texting, sometimes it doesn't feel very real because it's like just text on a screen and you feel like you're like role playing. But it seems a lot more than this. John's lawyer would go on to say John had fallen in love with Mark, claiming that he had seen Mark at a school surrounded by all these girls, and he got so jealous that he became suicidal because of it. And he really loved Mark. Like he didn't want to lose Mark, and he knew if he told Mark, hey, BTW, I've been Janet, I've been this person, that Mark would have been like, hey, I don't want to be around you at all. He felt like he had no out and that he needed to have Mark kill him. So the thing about John was he struggled a lot mentally. I mean, obviously, no one in their sane mind would ever do this at all. There has to be some kind of issue mentally going on. So John actually found out that when he was like 7 years old, that the man living with him and his mom wasn't actually his biological dad. And then he found out actually his dad was like very abusive. His mom would go on to say that he tried to kidnap John, and after a while he kind of craved that male attention. And then when his stepdad and his mom split up, they moved into a small house, and John began to constantly hear his mom cry, and that's when he began to withdraw and he started to self-harm. And he also got bullied a lot in school. He got called gay. He also got called like derogatory names. He was referred to as a terrorist because of his ethnicity, I'm assuming. He overall was very, very bullied, and he just kind of detached himself away. When his mom got remarried, she spent so much time with her new partner. She really didn't spend time with John, or at least John felt like he was truly rejected. He would actually sometimes, his therapist would say this, he would listen on the door to hear what his mom and stepdad were saying about him. And I think that's like very sad. And he kind of always felt like he didn't belong, but where he did belong was on the internet. So John received his very first laptop at 13 from his mom when he did really, really well in school, and he became hooked. He would spend hours and entire days just on his laptop using MSN. He was in chat rooms, and he actually said he would be on these like chat rooms from 4 p.m. to 7 a.m. Like, that's crazy. I don't know if his grades were plummeting, but I'm sure they were. But he actually began to stop eating because he was just so into chatting. John said that telling Mark these lies were like feeding a dog. He kind of became addicted to lying, but it doesn't really explain the whole reason of why. I think we might never really know the reasons as to why. I think that he did this because he was lonely, and maybe he was just kind of into like role playing. Maybe he should have got into some RPG, dude. I think that he just took a lot of inspiration, and then it got too far and he didn't know how to get out, and then he felt like, he didn't want to live anymore, and I think he felt like he needed to just take himself out, and the best way to do it was to have, I guess, Mark kill him by saying, I love you. The thing about the police is they said they were kind of impressed with John because he never gave away his identity at all. All the storylines were so fluid and all the characters were so unique that it just never gave away his actual identity. Like, not even in his email was his identity. And even with characters disappearing and reappearing, there was a lot of like reasons as to why. He'd come up with really good reasons. It would be like weeks before another character showed up. So it wasn't just like John logs in and then Rachel logs out. I mean, maybe that did happen and Mark just wasn't paying attention. But in my opinion, from what I've read, it seems like John was just really depressed and he felt like he wasn't worthy of love. He felt that he couldn't be in love and that no one could ever love him, and that's what he said. He said he wanted to become nothing, and so he created these characters, and I think these characters made him feel like he could be loved. A lot of the police tried to blame MSN for this, but it's like, you can't blame MSN. MSN didn't sponsor or support John into doing this. They did say that MSN needed to have more supervision, which I kind of will come talk about that in a little bit. So they ended up going to court though, and the judge was kind of confused because he was like, what the heck do I do with this case? And it was like very tricky. He's like, do I charge John with trying to incite his own murder? And it was also like the fact that like Mark wasn't deliberately going out. I mean, Mark did go out of his way to murder John, but he was also like completely brainwashed. At least that's what his lawyer said. And So this took place in May of 2004, so it was like a year later, and these two boys were there, and they wouldn't even look at each other, and they were very, very lucky. They both pled guilty, but they only got probation with some conditions, which was they couldn't have unsupervised internet sessions. They also could not communicate with each other, and I think they also had to go to therapy, which I think is the best outcome for both of them, because that could have went so backwards. Like, I'm really surprised that John did not get a harsher punishment. He could have easily gotten a charge for sexual abuse, CP, like all of that. One thing I saw that was very interesting is at the time, I think it would have been like 2004, a little bit after the case, they would go on to say that John had saw a psychologist and that he was getting help and he had a girlfriend now. But John would go on to say that he missed Mark and that he had to learn how to grieve their relationship, even though he had to realize that their relationship wasn't real, because Mark was in love with Rachel or Janet and it wasn't him. And he would go on to say that he doesn't know where he kind of belongs and he doesn't feel like he fits his family. And so that's kind of where the case ends. But I kind of want to like talk a little bit about it. So I think that John most likely was at least bisexual. I don't know his sexuality, so I'm not going to say he is. He was either gay or bisexual, I'm not too sure. But it seems like maybe he was in a family where he couldn't be gay or what, because like with his family doing the whole like, oh, like the whole gay thing was like very weird, but at least he has a girlfriend now. And it makes me kind of sad to think like maybe John felt like he had to be a girl to be accepted in a way, and maybe that's why he went on to play as like Rachel and all this stuff. And you know, it's just, it overall is very sad. So a few things I want to say though. First of all, about John, I don't think John deliberately went out of his way to be malicious, but I also don't think we should sit here and be like, oh, he was like depressed and he didn't have anyone, so maybe he's just really lonely, because I mean, he went very far. I mean, the whole Rachel thing could have been like, that would still be really messed up, but the fact that he went to the point where, you know, he was coercing Mark into doing sexual things and he literally had him give him oral sex by pretending that Janet said he had to. And it's still really messed up, but I think he's just very lucky that he didn't get a harsher punishment like CP. I don't think minors realize that like even if you're not an adult, if you're sending or receiving from another minor, it's still considered child sexual exploitation material, or CP. And yeah, like he's just very lucky. Now, I don't know if John has like, because John's got to be in his like late 30s now, so I don't know what he's doing now. And I hope he's not lying like this. And I hope that he's been able to maybe come out if he is gay, or has been able to deal with that, because I mean, it could have easily been like he struggled with his identity. This could have been like maybe he has a personality disorder. I don't want to diagnose him, obviously, but I think he also struggled a lot with not being seen by his family. When I read that his family didn't notice him not eating and that he was on the computer from 4 to 7, what do you mean? Like, why is his family not paying attention? You know, this was the time where the internet was so new, and maybe his parents didn't think that. And I don't know enough about his family to make like a comment on his mom, because maybe his mom like tried and he just didn't, or no, I don't know. But now we need to kind of talk a little bit about Mark. Mark to me is very interesting because he generally believed all this, and I do not know how someone at the age of 16 years old truly believed that the Secret Service would recruit you at 16 through MSN by doing sexual tasks on the camera. Like, what? And the fact that he was still willing to do all this and kill John, I don't know. I think like with Mark, it's very hard for me to know. I feel like Mark has to be someone with at least a learning disability. I saw a lot of people saying things like, oh, well, it was 2003. People didn't know a lot about scams. People didn't know about catfishing and all this. But a lot of other people who were also like a teenager at that time said like, no, like we weren't cavemen. We knew these things. And the fact that he thought he was going to meet the queen and all that, I do wonder if there is a learning disability or some kind of cognitive delay there, because I don't understand how like someone would think like that. I think that's just like very weird. I do find it very concerning that someone could be on the internet and could be so gullible, because I mean, the Rachel thing I could understand, but by the time he got to the Janet thing, wouldn't he be like, okay, all these people that I'm interacting with are dying and disappearing? Like, wouldn't you be like, okay? And like, he's 16, like he's not 10. If he was like a child, I'd be like, oh, that makes more sense. I don't know. I guess what I get concerned with Mark is that the fact that he was willing to kill someone thinking he's going to be in the British Secret Service, because what if John wasn't actually the perpetrator in this case? And like, I do want to say, like, Mark is still the victim, but what if he did kill John? He would have gotten a murder charge. Or what if it was someone else and he just killed? Like, it's just, to me, it's like, I don't understand how someone like that is gullible. I don't think someone who's that gullible should be on the internet or should be unsupervised. But I don't know, maybe this was like a learning lesson for him and he was like, okay. I don't know. I think if we found out that he had like some kind of cognitive delay, it would make more sense, because obviously I don't want to sit here make fun of Mark for that. We don't really know his actual mental state, but I do wonder about that. I think this entire case is a good lesson into don't believe everything you read. I know people still do that. I'm very surprised that Mark never sued John for this, because I mean, he easily could. I would have. Like, for emotional damages at least. Like, oh my god. That is the case of the John and Mark, the MSN story. If anything I said was wrong, or you want to correct me, or you want to join in on this conversation, feel free to comment below. If you have another type of case that you would like us to talk about, please let us know in the comments, or you can fill in our Google Doc form, and we will see you in our next episode.